favorite adventure you have ran or have run. There's a couple contenders. I mean, every one of these, I always say that, but one of my favorite adventures of all time, even though it's been pointed out severe weaknesses to it, is the Sunless Citadel, the very first adventure for 3rd edition. I don't know if it was literally the very first. I think there were like some tiny little sample dungeons and stuff, but definitely the first like official dungeon. It's really cool. It's got riddles in it. It's got puzzles in it. It's got an evil druid. There's spoilers, obviously, in this. It's got a carnivorous frog. It's got evil tree people. And it was a lot of fun to play. There's even a troll, if you care to face a troll at first level. I really enjoyed running that, and I've run it for multiple parties, made up of multiple different players. And each time it has gone completely different, and the experience has been completely different, despite the fact that the dungeon is entirely the same. And one of the things you'll learn if you've never DM'd before, the more often you DM, the better you get at it. And if you're going to DM a written module, the more you've read it and the more you've played it or run it, the better you'll do at it. So when you run it for your first group, well, first of all, you should always read an adventure at least twice, and preferably more than that, before you run it. Because reading it the first time will just give you an idea of what's going on. Then reading it the second time, you know what's in later room descriptions, and you'll be able to remember, one hopes, how it ties into earlier room descriptions. And the more you read through it, the better you know the adventure, the closer it is to the back of your hand, the better it will be when you run the adventure for your party. We're about to see, I'm rendering the other video, and it's about to pop up in a second here, so I want to just see if it pops up on screen. It does not. Good. The Sunless Citadel is probably one of the adventures I have run the most of all adventures. The follow-up adventure, The Forge of Fury, is probably one of my favorite adventures in theory, but it's much longer than the Sunless Citadel. It takes longer to get through than the Sunless Citadel, and I've played the first 1/2 to 3/4 of that dungeon as a player probably 6 or 7 times. Once you get into the second level of the dungeon, suddenly that's when the campaign stops happening. This has happened both in real life when my brother was DMing, and this was back when we were in junior high and high school, so we were both still living at home. It's not like my brother went away in the army or something. It's just the rest of the players kind of stopped playing, and so that kind of ends the adventure. It's also happened online in play-by-posts. It's also happened online in a play-by-chat when we were using AOL Instant Messenger to play the game. But I do really like The Forge of Fury. One that I've tried to run, but it stopped very soon, was the 4th adventure, which the name escapes me. It's the one that I remember, the Standing Stones, which is the 7th level adventure in that adventure path. But I can't remember. Oh, maybe it is the 3rd one. Anyway, it's the one where you're in town and there's an evil cult, and there's someone behind the scenes manipulating the mayor of town, or the duke, or whoever it is. Why can't I remember the name of it? That's one where I've really liked to have run it again and again, because the first time I did it, it took a while to kind of get it going, and then the campaign fell apart. One of the characters in there was able to cast darkness. I remember that because there's some monsters in that adventure who don't have eyes. They have blind sense, so they can see in the dark, quote unquote, see in the dark. And the player thought he was being so clever by casting darkness, and I'm like, dude, you are doing my work for me. When it comes to older school adventures, there's a couple where I've read them but never run them or play them. I know of the Keep of the Borderlands. I know of the Tomb of Horrors. I know of White Plume Mountain. One I have run several different times is B1, Into the Unknown, which is a basic D&D adventure that I have mentioned in these videos already. It is an excellent dungeon, but it's put together in a way that they don't do anymore. Well, 4th edition kind of went back to it. Essentially, all the rooms are mapped out, and all the room descriptions are there, but you as the DM have to put the monsters and the treasure in. And there's a list of the monsters and a list of the treasure, and you just pick them and put them in the rooms kind of at random. So it plays out differently based on the DM, and you can even have the same DM make it play out differently, only because the monsters and the treasure move around. When I found that adventure in my dad's trunk, my dad had actually written in pencil throughout the adventure what's in each room. So every time I ran it how he had laid it out, which was kind of fun. It was also kind of weird, because there's like a secret door in one of the rooms that leads to like a hidden bedroom and study. And that is where my dad decided to put the adventuring gnome party. So there's some gnomes that are not, they're good creatures, and they're not necessarily hostile to the party. But you're not going to find them unless you happen to find the secret door that they went through to get into this bedroom. I think there's 2 rooms behind the secret room. They're not in the room with the bed. They're in a room with a dresser, though. And I think there's like a silver spoon or something in the dresser, and that's one of the treasures. It's weird. My favorite room from that dungeon is actually a... well, it says favorite dungeon type or location is 12, but that's fine. There is a room full of pools, and it's actually a pretty famous room, having appeared in this earliest dungeon. And each of the pools, if you drink it, has a different effect. And they're not all good, and they're not all bad, and they're not all... Some of them, one of the pools is actually just water. But there's something like 13 or 15 different pools, and there's a bunch of random effects for them. And so that's a pretty fun one. There's also a maze where if you go far enough in the maze, it teleports you to another exact replica of the maze at a different area of the dungeon and completely screws you up if you're mapping. But that's also not the favorite adventure that I have run. My favorite adventure that I have run is the Red Hand of Doom. I think I mentioned that in another video where I couldn't quite remember the name of it. But it's the adventure where, again, a little bit of spoilers, the party travels to this town and gets recruited to help take out some hobgoblins, and in the process discover that the hobgoblins are building up a giant army with plans to sweep across the Elsyr Vale and basically take over. And as you go through the adventure, you go to different sites in the Elsyr Vale and defeat different factions within the hobgoblin army, or otherwise set them back. And each time, based on what you do at each location, you gain victory points. And in the final battles, the number of victory points you have determines whether or not you've weakened the hobgoblin army enough for the human, elf, dwarf armies to hold them off and win the war. And this is also the adventure where the guy who is at the top of the tower with the giant hole in the middle is one of the final bosses. The adventure also features a bunch of dragons. These are all spoilers. I mentioned spoilers at the beginning. This was one of actually the first adventures where I completely remember killing a player. Not a player, a player character. Killing a player, man, I'd go to jail. Killed a player character. At one point you encounter a manticore, and one of the players was playing a barbarian and totally thought he could take on a manticore, and the manticore shot him with spikes, and the guy took some damage, and he's like, yeah, bring it on. And then the manticore landed and brought it. Claw, bite, and you are at, what? Negative con hit points? Well, you are outright dead, dude. And so his character died, and that wasn't that far into the adventure. I mean, it's several parts. I think it's like 2 or 3 parts into the game when that happened. So he had some adventure and built up a little bit of a rapport with this character, and then he died. But fortunately, there's also a staff of resurrection in that area of the adventure, and so they were able to bring him back to life using it. There's also a fight with a dragon around water. And I remember this was one of the first times. Well, I wouldn't. Yeah, it's not the first time that I winged a fight, but it's the first time I remember doing it and doing it very well, where the players were actually really impressed by it. So there's this black dragon, and they're fighting against him, and literally, I think the first or second turn of the fight, that same barbarian got a really lucky critical hit and dealt enough damage that technically the dragon would be dead. But the dragon is like the boss monster of the area. So the fact that the party like unleashed the beast on it, dealt a lot of damage, all of them dealt a lot of damage, but then that barbarian's critical hit just wrecked it. I said, no, that's not good enough. This fight would have been very anticlimactic. So I said, no, he still has hit points. And they continued to fight a little bit, and they ended up, the dragon ended up grappling the barbarian and then diving into the water and holding him under there and almost suffocated him. And then finally, just a round or two before the barbarian would have suffocated, which immediately puts you to 0 hit points, he managed to escape the grapple and swim back to the surface. And it was a very dramatic fight. It was very dangerous for the party. And at the end of it, they said, oh man, that was awesome. And I'm like, well, you guys technically killed the dragon on turn 2 of the fight. And I said, but that would have sucked. So I did all of this on top of that. And they're like, yeah, that was really good. We like that. I said, good, because that's what happened. But I also didn't cheat like that in the future. There's one point where they're defending a town. I say a town, actually, one of the cities. And the hobgoblin, this is the part where the victory points matter. The hobgoblin army is attacking and they're marching down the streets. And there's one part where they have to defend against wave after wave of enemy. So the enemies come in and it's just like, here's a section of enemies that come in and fight. And then the players have a couple rounds to recover, cast healing spells and buff spells and that. And then the next wave of guys shows up. And it goes on like that. There's like a half dozen waves or 10 waves or something ridiculous like that come every few minutes or so. And at the time, the druid had spike stones, which creates these stones made out that form spikes in the roadway. And it lasts a ridiculous amount of time. And they were like, well, if we cast this down the road where all these waves are coming from, what's going to happen? And I look at it and I'm like, you're going to roll damage, I guess. And the spike stones work over a gigantic area. And these guys, the bad guys, are supposed to march right through it. So I let them slaughter 2, 3, 4 waves of enemies just from them trying to march through the spiked stones. Obviously the enemies didn't march and just kill themselves. They kind of went different ways and the party essentially defeated them. But, they definitely got the upper hand in that encounter. But yeah, Red Hand of Doom is an amazing adventure. It was one of the very last adventures that came out for 3rd edition, and it shows that they took a lot of experience from writing adventures all through the life of 3rd edition and then made Red Hand of Doom. And there's like some sidebars throughout the adventure where the designers explained why things are working like they do, why the adventure was put together like it was, which really helps when you understand the intentions behind it. And now it's not a perfect adventure by any means. If you go online, even to this day, it might be kind of hard with Wizards' website with all of the changes they've made to their message board since then. Although I'm sure somewhere it's archived. There were thread after thread after thread on the message boards of people quote-unquote fixing some of the minor problems that are in the adventure, other ones expanding on the adventure, other ones, just kind of making it more verisimilitudinous. And there's a lot of good ideas there. In fact, I remember one of the few problems is that there's somewhere you're supposed to get a key, and it never mentions where the key is. Like, it just says in the adventure, the players pick this key up in the last part. Well, there's no mention of the key in the last part. Another reason why you have to read through the adventure multiple times, because otherwise you run this part of the adventure, then next week you get to this part of the adventure and it mentions a key. Well, I don't remember any key. So there are a couple things to fix, and other people were adapting the adventure to be run in different campaign settings, be it Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or Eberron or wherever, and it was an excellent adventure. 4th edition drew on the immense popularity of Red Hand of Doom, and their first, I believe it was their first official adventure path, was called Scales of War, and it was a sequel to the Red Hand of Doom campaign. And I've enjoyed greatly a few times starting to run that game, but set in Legend of the Five Rings Rokugan instead. And I might have mentioned this in a video, I don't quite remember. But in Rokugan, which is Legend of the Five Rings, which if you ever bought the 3rd edition Oriental Adventures handbook, that is where those Shugenja from the Lion Clan, the Phoenix Clan, the Unicorn Clan, etc. come from, and where Rokugan, the whole setting for Oriental Adventures was Rokugan. Rokugan is owned by Wizards of the Coast, but it's licensed to Alderac Entertainment Group, and they're the ones who make the card game and the role-playing game and everything like that. I'm really big into Legend of the Five Rings, although I haven't been recently because they created 4th edition of Legend of the Five Rings, and I just haven't gotten around to being able to buy and read the books. Anyway, in Rokugan, there's the Crab Clan, and they're in the far southwest of Rokugan, and they, long ago, they border on the Shadowlands, which is literally like an evil, diseased wasteland where literally, and again, I mean literally, an evil god is buried in the middle of the Shadowlands. He fell from heaven so hard, and he's buried in a crater in the middle of the Shadowlands. And he's so evil that his evil has leached out and warped all the plants and animals, and monsters like Oni and ogres and demons crawl up from the pit and occupy the land, and they constantly try to invade Rokugan, and the only people standing between them and Rokugan are the Crab Clan and the Great Caillou Wall. And the first adventure in the Scales of War adventure path for 4th edition involves one of the hobgoblins invading the town nearby and stealing some artifacts that came from the Red Hand of Doom army, because he's trying to resurrect the army. It should be noted that one of the castles near the Great Caillou Wall in Crablands has the skull of a great Oni known as Tusk up on the wall as a reminder to the Oni that they got their butts handed to them, even when a demon as great as Tusk was leading them. So I had them steal that. And then the second adventure, after you have to travel into the Hobgoblin lands and invade a small castle and rescue some kidnapped villagers and these artifacts. Then, in the second adventure, there is a dwarven fortress up in the mountains, and there's a huge orc army that's trying to invade the Elsir Vale, which I guess is allied with the Hobgoblins. And they know they can't make it through the dwarven fortress, which is guarding the mountain passes, but there are these old tunnels. They're like, well, I say steam tunnels, but there's these tunnels that go underneath the mountains, and so the orcs are pouring their army into these tunnels, and then if you don't stop them by closing off the tunnels in time, they'll pop out the other end of the dwarven fortress and have free reign to continue on into Elsir Vale. Well, that's totally the dark armies of the Shadowlands being able to tunnel under the Great Caillou Wall and arise on the other side and be able to invade Rokugan. The adventure for the first part of it, the first 10 levels, pretty closely follows along with something that you could totally do in Legend of the Five Rings. And I really don't like the way 4th edition plays for D&D, but restructuring it to be Legend of the Five Rings, it totally works for me. Just like for some reason Psionics doesn't work for me in medieval settings, but as soon as you say it's future, perfectly fine for me. So that is the original Red Hand of Doom is the favorite adventure I have ever run. I love it so very much. I guess that's it. Until next time, bye-bye.